Ethics Committee did a very secretive vote in order to ensure that privately funded travel for representatives wouldn't have to be disclosed on financial disclosure forms. Now, this is a bit of an issue because obviously we know that there's a problem with legalized bribery here in the country, but now politicians can actually hide that legalized bribery. So let me give you the details. It's going to be a little more difficult to ferret out which members of Congress are lavished with all expenses paid trips around the world after the House has quietly stripped away the requirement that such privately sponsored travel be included on lawmakers' annual financial disclosure forms. The move, made behind closed doors and without a public announcement by the House Ethics Committee, reverses more than 3 decades of precedent.
So National Journal did a great job of finding this out because all of a sudden things stopped showing up on the expense reports where they're supposed to show up, and they're like, what's going on here? And so we'll give you the details of where they're showing up in a second. But Shane Goldmacher here with a great story. And when he says 3 decades of precedent, the reason they set the rules in the first place is because during Watergate, people were like, hey, wait a minute, turns out there's a ton of corruption here and we should limit it. Now, corruption's become so standard place, like, yeah, have at it, Hoss, go to whatever trip you want. And these trips are so expensive, which again, you'll see in a second how expensive they are. They're like, yeah, just don't, make sure the reporters don't see it. Make sure the American people don't see it, and then do whatever the hell you want.
Yeah, it's crazy. Now, one thing that I should note is they do have to disclose this information on the House's office of the clerk, right? But the reality is that's not something that's accessible to reporters and journalists. So it's going to be even more difficult for journalists to see what kind of trips they're going on, who's funding those trips, basically who is bribing this politician so they do what he or she wants. So I think that Melanie Sloan, who's with Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics, makes a really, really great point. She says the following: this is such an obvious effort to avoid accountability. There's no legitimate reason. There's no good reason for it. And it's absolutely true. One thing that's really interesting is, since this was such a secretive, closed-door vote, all of a sudden you have some representatives that are still disclosing who's funding their private trips, right? And then you have others that aren't. So I think that's the reason why all of a sudden there was a red flag and reporters started to notice it, and then they realized that there's a new policy.
So from time to time, these legislators will go on a congressional fact-finding trip that's somewhat useful. They might go to Egypt, they might go to Kandahar. Usually those are dog and pony shows too, and you don't learn that much. But look, sometimes it's helpful to talk face-to-face with a country's leader, etc. So I don't want to stop all that, right? But understand that that's not the majority of the trips. The majority of the trips are to play golf in Scotland, to the Bahamas, fact-finding trips to, to Bora Bora, So, and they're not unaware, the lobbyists that do this are not unaware that those congressmen and their wives and husbands often want to go, right? And that'll stick in the back of their head, oh, John was good to me. Now, one other trick here is, now technically lobbyists can't give it to them, right? But nonprofit groups can. So they set up a nonprofit group that's directly linked to the lobbyists, gets the money from the lobbyists, and they go, what? It's a nonprofit group. The nonprofit group wanted to fact find in the Bahamas, and so they had all these lovely people go to the Bahamas. It's a fact-finding trip. But by the way, we're still a little embarrassed, so we're going to take a secret vote to make this even more secret.
Yeah. So Shane Goldmacher mentions in the article that there are some trips that could cost as much as $50,000. So there were some politicians that were flown out to Australia, first class or business class, and that cost about $50,000. If you have a so-called nonprofit group that has a political agenda funding a trip like that, yeah, you're more likely to vote in their favor. Just another form of corruption and legalized bribery. Now, just to give you a sense of how much was spent on these very lavish trips in 2013 alone, there were about a total of 1,900 trips, and it cost $6 million.
So that's basically $6 million in legalized bribes. So they say, would you like a fancy trip? And by the way, your wife can come on it, or your husband, like I said, first class oftentimes, incredible resorts that they get, 4-star hotels they get to stay in. Of course they want that. And it's not to find facts. It's to find a nice margarita. Okay, that's why they're going. And do they do favors for those nonprofit groups later? You betcha. That's the whole point. I have one last thing to say about this. Wolf-pack.com. Okay, bring out the wolves. We got to go get these guys. You want to hide? You want to go in the woods and hide? oh, look at that, I found a wolf pack in the woods. Come to Papa, wolf-pack.com. Let's go get him.